Warning. The system has become unstable.
This whole system is deeply flawed, and that's why I talk a lot about free markets and property rights, Austrian economics, and getting rid of the Fed. All these things are now up for grabs. A lot of people, especially the young people, are looking at this. So for this reason, I'm a bit encouraged by, what might come out of this. But I think we're going to go through the ringer. I think it's going to get much, much worse, and it's bad enough already. But there's no way that we can step back. The one thing I'm convinced of after having spent so much time in Washington is that this will not be a gradual recovery from this disaster that we have. We're not going to elect enough people and enough courage to vote the right way, and there's too much demagoguing and too much misunderstanding that people would revolt. But the collapse will come, it's going to hit the dollar, and then we're going to have our opportunity. So the more people who are protected intellectually as well as financially, the better off we'll be in rebuilding what we'll have, what we'll need to do in the near future.
Buckle your seatbelt. It's time for another episode of the Prepper Recon Podcast.
The threats to our way of life are legion. If you want to survive, you need a plan. The 7-Step Survival Plan by best-selling preparedness experts David Cobbler and Mark Goodwin will provide a blueprint to make sure you're ready for the dark days ahead. The book covers all the prepper basics, including bug-out bags, barter items, and security. Survival favors the prepared. Buy the 7-Step Survival Plan in paperback, Kindle, or audio edition at Amazon.com today.
I've personally been buying gold and silver from JM Bullion for over 2 years. They offer the best prices over spot that I can find, and I've never had a problem with an order. If you're
Today's
looking to
guest
trade
is
in some
Dr.
of your
Dennis
fiat
Cuddy.
paper
Dr.
for
Cuddy
real
has written
money,
several
check out
books on the New World Order
jmbullion.com
and
today.
the plans of the globalist elites. And I have to thank Jim Rice, one of our regular listeners, for getting your contact info for me. Dr. Cuddy, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, for listeners who may not yet be aware of what's going on behind the scenes in banking and government, can you give us a brief synopsis?
Well, in my latest book, which is called The Power Elite, Their History and Future, I go into the background of this group that I call the Power Elite. They've been around for centuries. It used to be there would be a sort of hereditary groupings. You would have kings and queens, but since the Industrial Revolution, you would have families that were not monarchs. You might have the Rockefellers and other families, but there are also individuals. George Soros, for example, today, and some others are very powerful people working in concert. And in case that sounds like some kind of crazy conspiracy theory, what I do that's a little different than most people who look at this is I try to get the actual primary documents, diaries, private papers, secret records, things which other people don't have. One example would be Colonel House, who was Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor. He alone is responsible, believe it or not, for many of the problems that we have. And to my knowledge, his diary has never been published. However, it was under lock and key for about 75 years after his death, just by the family's agreement regarding his private material. And then, as they were coming out from under that, a friend of mine went by Yale University Library and said, "Can I look at it?" And the archivist said, "Well, since it's just out from under the 75-year moratorium, and it's going to be published, the publisher had bought the rights, sure, go on in and look at the stuff, and you can make some copies." Well, as it turned out, the publisher didn't publish it, and sometimes these publishers, if they're very particular about things, they buy the rights to something just so it will not be published. They want to keep stuff secret. And so I have a page from there showing how the Colonel House, for example, when the leaders of Europe, Clemenceau, Orlando, and also Woodrow Wilson, were concerned about the new Soviet Union in 1917, and we're thinking, well, maybe we can put down this expansion of the Soviets, this new group here controlling Russia. House in his diary says, I told them that no, you can't do anything about this. And he says, then he said, of course, he didn't use the word lie, but he says, of course, I knew we could have. Simply one armored division could have put them down and stopped their expanse. So just imagine if House had actually told them the truth, and an armored division had halted the spread of the Soviet Union. It is entirely possible that there would have been no communist spread anywhere, meaning China, no Korean War, no Vietnam War, no nothing. So one person at a critical point in history can have this effect, and House was an agent of these powerful people, the power elite. And they've been around for many, many years, and without going into the specifics, what happens is, of course, they want power and control. They use a dialectical process of pitting one group against another. For centuries, they would pit Catholics against Protestants, and then today it's Jews against Arabs, within the Muslim movement, Sunnis against Shia, and so forth and so on. So that there's this constant crisis and conflict, and they manage things largely by crises. Whether it's in education, you'll have an education crisis, or you'll have an economic crisis, and they also use the global economy toward that end as well, with the ultimate goal of being a synthesis, which is what the dialectical process is all about, of Eastern communism and Western capitalism into a world socialist government is the ultimate goal, and that's sort of an overview, and we can get into the particulars if you want.
And as far as pitting people against each other and having somebody that could have just completely put an end to something that's become a conflict in our recent memory. Could we say that happened in Iraq? I mean,
sure.
Before the de-Baathification, I mean, there was some type of process between the Sunnis and the Shias in Iraq, where it was kind of like Democrats and Republicans here. It wasn't really what you'd call functional, but it was sort of that dysfunctional family that had learned how to live together. But when Paul Bremer went in there, he just kind of blew up what was not that broken, and he broke it more, didn't he?
Yeah, and this is largely planned. Now, I'm not going to say one individual did everything and is the mastermind behind these things, but what they do, the power elite rather create situations from which they know what the reaction will be, and that's very useful to them in terms of everything, like 9/11. There's a crisis. Before 9/11, the polls would show the public is very, very concerned and protective about its freedoms. But the very afternoon of 9/11, ABC Washington Post took a poll and showed 2/3 of the people would now be willing to give up some of their freedoms in order to have security. And so then the power elite immediately has ready to go, the Patriot Act and Homeland Security Act, immediately ready to go. It's already planned in advance, and so that's what they do. They'll use a situation, and then the public reaction is, "Oh, please do such and such for us," and then they come along and say, "Okay, if this is what you want, and that they found that's much more effective than just trying to impose some horrible regime on a particular population, because the public can't say much because the public actually requested, that they take over, and they're always ready and willing to take over whatever the situation is. So they use crises to generate that, whether it's economic crises or some sort of military or foreign policy crisis or education crisis, and Common Core. The children aren't learning well. Okay, well here's you want some improvement. Okay, here's Common Core. That's sort of what they do. And so regarding Iraq, what you need to do is take an example. Now, Cecil Rhodes, the big gold and diamond magnate in South Africa, isn't the only one. There's Skull and Bones people and Fabian socialists, and they all play their part. But in this case, you had Cecil Rhodes form a secret society, the Society of the Elect, to take over the world. I mean, when I say that, a lot of people with conspiracy theories just say this. But that's what Rhodes said. He said, quote, "Fancy the charm to young America to participate in a scheme to take the government of the whole world." And then he went on later and said they would absorb the wealth of the world. And Rhodes scholars like Bill Clinton and others are part of this, a very, very important part. of it. And so what they would do is he formed a secret society in 1891 and had a lot of key individuals in place, including Germans. They were part of it. He had this society, and they had people in all of the Commonwealth nations, as well as in the U.S., as well as in Germany and South Africa, and so on. And they were in charge of British foreign policy from about the 1900s up until the beginning of the Second World War, is where they were in control. And various people within that group, within the society, they had an inner circle and an outer circle, a circle of initiates, and then an association of helpers around them. Would play their own particular role. They wanted to penetrate, Rhodes said, largely politics, economics, journalism, and education, but other fields as well. But those were the primary fields they wanted to take over. And so in terms of Iraq, for example, what you had was a fellow named Sir Percy Cox, and he was part of this, the sort of British foreign affairs. And one of his jobs was to literally carve out the nations of that area. And so he literally created, in about 1921, the nation of Kuwait, so that Iraq would not have a direct outlet to the sea and therefore would be more dependent upon, British foreign policy. And they did the same thing in Africa. They would carve out colonies within Africa, pitting in Nigeria, maybe the Igbo against the Yoruba in the east and the west, and the Hausa, Muslim and the Christians, River State types in the south, and so forth and so on. They would do this all over the place. So you would have a division, so there would be this natural internal conflict within nations. And so in Iraq, for example, whether it's Iraq or Libya or all of these nations, they would plot at an early stage for whoever would be the up-and-coming ruler of the nation. You would have them actually groom people, whether it's in the U.S., in a particular state, in Europe, it doesn't matter. They would watch these young people as they were coming up and be sure that they get on city councils, and then run for the state house or whatever parliament in a particular European country and so on. And so they would groom these people and be sure that individuals who were amenable to what they wanted done received advantages, campaign financing and so forth and so on. So moving the story quickly along, in Iraq, for example, what they did was work with what was the OSS and later became CIA in America to decide who would rule various countries, including Iraq. So Saddam Hussein, as a young fellow in Iraq, literally started out as a member of a 6-member assassination team supported by the CIA. And their assignment in 1959 was to assassinate the prime minister of Iraq. And same thing in Gaddafi with Libya in the late 60s. He was a young up-and-comer, and so he got our support to be head of Libya. And then, the Shah of Iran, for example, when Mossadegh was elected in 1952 as head of Iran, but he wanted to nationalize their oil industry. Well, the parallel, the British and the Americans don't like that, and so they plotted the overthrow of Mossadegh. The plan was largely carried out with the CIA support. There's Frank Wisner Sr. and Kermit Roosevelt, and the actual training of the overthrowers was done by Alan Dulles with a $10 million slush fund in Bern, Switzerland, that he gave to General Norman Schwarzkopf's father, who had just retired as the head of the New Jersey State Police, to train these people. They had a lot of Nazis. My next to last book is about a secret Nazi plan. The Nazis really were not defeated. They were not defeated. And they would go into Iran and foment, a revolutionary attitude against this elected individual, Mossadegh, and overthrow him, so that in 1953 they replaced Mossadegh with the younger Shah of Iran, the one who a lot of your listeners may be familiar with. But then when his time was up in the late 70s and they wanted the Ayatollah Khomeini to come in, they had a coup, a revolution, and so forth, and he was deposed. The reason for that was there was also supposed to be a conflict not only within religions and within nations, but also between nations. So a conflict was created between Iran and Iraq, and the whole Shia and Sunni animosity which has been around since the days of Muhammad. I mean, the origin of that goes back to who Muhammad's legitimate successor would be. There were two individuals. I think one was a son, one was a nephew who was his right-hand man, and so on. That's where the division occurred. And so at the heart of things in Iraq, for example, in the de-Baathification that you mentioned, what you look for is incompetence. So when Bremer goes in and they disband the military, disband the police, and so forth, this is a sure sign of incompetence on the part of the U.S. and Bremer. Now, you might say, oh, look, well, they're just stupid. Well, no, I suspect they're not stupid. As Nasser said, the head of Egypt in the 1950s, he said, and this is paraphrasing, he said, you Americans don't make simple, stupid mistakes. You make complicated, stupid mistakes, which makes us wonder as to what you're really up to, surreptitiously. So there's a certain amount of playing dumb. It's like President Obama when he gave us Obamacare, and it was rolled out very inefficiently and poorly, and people say, "Oh, look how stupid he is." Well, my hunch is nobody could be that stupid, and so you have to look at the possibility of planned incompetence, so that if something is incompetently rolled out, then you have a sort of panic, the crisis on the part of the people, and oh my goodness, the premiums are going to go higher and higher, and so he says, oh, there's a crisis, okay, I'll come in and solve your crisis by subsidizing it for you, and then the public said, oh, well, if you're going to subsidize Obamacare, and the public has been dumbed down so much, they're so stupid that they don't understand that the subsidization is going to come from their tax dollars, so they're really subsidizing themselves. Plus the fact that anything the federal government subsidizes is going to control, and so voila, now you have them having death panels or whatever you want to call them, and the public really can't say anything because the public demanded subsidization of Obamacare, right? So this is what I call planned incompetence. So in Iraq, the planned incompetence went far beyond just disbanding the military and the police. It involved a lack of planning of, well, how are we going to collect the garbage? How are we going to get the electricity running again? And what happens when we whiz into Iraq with the sign "Mission Accomplished," and which was also planned. It was planned that we would whiz in there. I mean, Saddam Hussein wanted us to whiz into Baghdad, because only by letting us whiz into Baghdad from Kuwait would we get out of battle formation and could be more easily attacked by IEDs and RPGs, right? So all that was planned, even though we thought, hey, look how successful we are going in here. And so we go in there and we depose him, and apparently nobody thought, well, if we depose all these people and disband the military and police, what happens when some 18-year-old private is standing there in the middle of Mosul or wherever, and some Iraqi woman runs up to him and starts screaming at him in Arabic that her daughter's been kidnapped, and he says, say what? What am I supposed to? And so nothing can be done that stupidly and incompetently. So you have to figure the possibility that's planned incompetence. Well, you say, well, why would they want to plan incompetence? Well, if they plan incompetence, then the new government in Iraq will say, oh, please don't leave. Oh, you say you want a huge embassy as a listening post and, a permanent CIA station. Okay, sure, whatever you want, right? And so they ask us and beg us to stay in what has become, I think, probably the largest embassy in the world there. And so you have this huge embassy in Iraq, but then nobody says, well, wait a minute, you say they're all going to love us because we've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and the leaders of the country say, yeah, they'll all love us. Well, why should they all? Why should they all love us? In the first place, the Sunnis had it pretty good under Saddam, right? So the Sunnis aren't going to love us. Secondly, you're simply providing a resurgence of the animosity between the Shia and the Sunni, which under Saddam had largely been controlled. I mean, he wasn't nice to the Shia, but he wasn't running in there and slaughtering them all over the place anyway. And he also allowed the Christians to say, I mean, they were sort of isolated, but he didn't bother them. And now, 90% of the Christians have had to flee because they're getting their churches burned and slaughtered themselves, right? So it's a massive mess over there. And if you look at it, it's sort of like Obama can't possibly be that stupid with Obamacare. Well, George W. Bush can't possibly be that stupid with Iraq and foreign policy. Now, what you have to understand also, though, is that these people, Obama and Bush before him, are not mental giants who are maniacally Machiavellian-like planning all this stuff. These guys, our presidents, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They're puppets. They're puppets of the power elite. And so George Bush, to show that he really has a certain amount of incompetence, just like Obama has incompetence, George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, had to be tutored for 2 years by a group called the Vulcans, which was Condoleezza Rice and George Shultz and others, so he could even be up to speed enough to even run for the presidency. So what you have is George W. Bush coming in there knowing diddly squat about foreign affairs and what to do about it. He doesn't know to ask the right questions. And you say, well, that's okay. He surrounds himself with people who are real smart. Well, those people are the agents of the power elite, so they're the ones who are executing the power elite's plans. Democrat or Republicans, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski is an agent of the power elite who's sort of with the Democrats. He was Jimmy Carter's advisor, Barack Obama's advisor. Henry Kissinger is the agent for the Republicans. He was advisor, to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and all this. So they have a division of duties here. And in terms of the families, the hereditary elite, for example, David Rockefeller works largely they work with everybody, but he works largely with the communists. He's very, very much friends with Fidel Castro right from the beginning, with Castro's revolution. And his daughters, David Rockefeller's daughters and Fidel's daughters, have for decades been palsy-walsy, vacationing together. Now, this is a guy, Fidel Castro, who's slaughtering his own people right and left. And also David Rockefeller wrote a glowing article for Mao Zedong in the early 1970s, and of course Mao Zedong slaughtered millions of innocent Chinese. But David Rockefeller says, hey, these things happen, but it's all for the good. He's done a lot of good. Mao Zedong has. He's, the butcher of Beijing. He's done a lot of good. And so, but his brother Nelson Rockefeller worked with the Nazis. See, so there's a division of duties there. And so back to Iraq, what they wanted to do was play the Sunni against the Shia, have that resurrected. You want to have this Iran, which is largely Shia, against Iraq, which was dominated by Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni. Even though the Sunnis were a minority within Iraq, Saddam Hussein and his sort of family there, his sons and the whole group there were Sunnis, and so they were at war against Iran. And of course, to have a war, you have to provide weapons, right? And so we, as an equal opportunity warmonger country, we would supply both of them, with chemicals, so they could have their chemical weapons and slaughter each other with the chemical weapons. And so, we do that sort of stuff. We have these revolts. Milosevic, for example, in Yugoslavia, he didn't do what the power elite wanted, so he had to go. Well, you don't just say, we're going to go in there and drop a bunch of bombs on this Milosevic because we don't like him. No. They don't do that, right? They create situations, okay? So what you do is you have the Kosovo Liberation Army, and it goes and gets trained in Macedonia by some Al-Qaeda members. See, we're supposed to hate Al-Qaeda? No. There's the good Al-Qaeda and the bad Al-Qaeda. The bad Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan, and there's, I think, like 100 of them or something like that, Joe. But they've been holding us off, for decades now. It's holding us off. But then there's the good Al-Qaeda that we work with. That's what ISIS is. ISIS, at first, was the good Al-Qaeda. And in Libya, the same sort of thing. There's the good Al-Qaeda. And now, they have offshoots. They're all not known as, Al-Qaeda. But ISIS, for example, was originally known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's what it was originally known as. So we work with these guys. So we help train this Kosovo Liberation Army, and they go to Kosovo, and then they tippy-toe across the border and start assassinating mayors and policemen in Serbia, right? And so Milosevic says, well, we can't have you coming over here and slaughtering our mayors and policemen. And so he reacts, right? And so the Kosovo Liberation Army runs back over into its home of Kosovo and says, ooh, look, we're being attacked by this evil Milosevic. Humanitarian crisis. And we say, oh, humanitarian crisis. Okay, now we can intervene. See, now we have a legitimate, recognized reason to intervene with these poor people, these poor Kosovo people being slaughtered here by this evil Milosevic. So that's what they do, and Iraq is part of that plan. And you say, well, why Iraq? Well, because they plan this way in advance. So the New World Order is how you began the show, and H.G. Wells is famous author who's knowledgeable about all this stuff. He's an insider, and so he wrote a book called The New World Order in 1939. And in there, he's looking to the future, and he says in 50 years or so, there'll be this world state, and that's what he called it, the New World Order, the world state, and it will come out of a conference in where? Basra, Iraq. Not London, not Moscow, not Paris, not New York, but Basra, Iraq. This is back in 1939 when Basra, Iraq, if you ask people in this country, Basra where? What's a Basra? But he said, yeah, that's where it's going to be. So this is the nexus. And they say, well, why? Well, if you look at Brzezinski and the Paralite, Brzezinski, I have the tapes of the first State of the World Forum from 1995, Gorbachev's first State of the World Forum. He's such a nice guy that we gave him the Presidio in San Francisco, former military base, to have his Gorbachev Foundation. He holds his first State of the World initiative. All the big shots from around the world come. And I have a tape of Brzezinski there, and he's addressing all these leaders. And he said, look, we're not going to get to our world government through one quick leap. What we'll have to do is a regionalization approach first. Well, they got NAFTA, right, North American Free Trade Agreement. They got the European Union. They have an African Union. They have ASEAN for Asia. They have a Mediterranean Union for the Mediterranean area. So the only real major place that's missing is the Middle East, right? So that's why all of this consternation and turmoil in that particular region, right? So they have to stir the pot there, and of course, you wear the people down. You get the internal conflicts within Syria and Iraq and all over the place, in Yemen and the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth and so on. And what happens is the plan goes so far back that you have to understand that Karl Marx was created by these people, and Hitler was created by these people. You say, well, what do you mean created? Well, in the dialectical process, you have this young American republic established, free enterprise capitalism. So they create the antithesis for the dialectical process. That would be communism, that's Karl Marx. And then the synthesis of capitalism and communism would be socialism, the ultimate goal, world socialist government. But before you can have a world socialist government, each nation has to be socialist first. And that's what the word Nazi means, national socialism. So they had to create Hitler. Well, his assignment was immediately in the 1930s to work with this new group called the Muslim Brotherhood. They allied with them, and then in 1942 they developed a secret Nazi plan, which was to lose the World War II on purpose and militarily, and at the same time develop a secret plan which would come about today in about 2 generations, they said. And so all of this Arab Spring stuff and ISIS stuff and Iraq stuff and Iran stuff, all that is part of this secret Nazi plan, which is a sub-part of this larger power elite plan. And so that's the short version.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Cuddy Armor offers affordable body armor, including level 3 trauma plates made of AR-500 steel. They can endure multiple rounds from pistols and rifles up to 7.62 NATO. Their plates are available with Rhino Linings coatings to reduce SPA. Go to CuddyArmor.com, that's CATI armor.com today.
When disaster strikes, it's too late to prepare. PrepperRecon.com offers MOLLE-compatible individual first aid kits for your home, auto, or bug-out bag. These kits have everything you need to address a traumatic injury, including an Israeli battle dressing, quick clot, EMT shears, suture kit, Steri-strips, tourniquet, ACS chest seal, tough strip bandages, gauze, and so much more. $89 includes shipping. To buy your individual first aid kit, go to PrepperRecon.com and click the store tab at the top of the homepage. Order today before it's too late.
A couple of things you mentioned. You mentioned the Nazis, and you said they lost on purpose. And so that makes me think, and then you said that there was a plan for it to come back around. And I'm starting to see some similarities right now in America that look very, very much like National Socialism. Everything from welfare to military ambition to maybe one of the most haunting similarities would be at the beginning of Nazi socialism. Of course, there was a prominent building that was attacked by a group of so-called terrorists, and out of that came the Reichstag fire decree, which basically stripped the German citizens from their constitution, and they lost all their constitutional rights. They lost their rights to privacy. They lost several other enumerated rights in their constitution, and they gladly handed it over.
Yeah.
That's probably the most haunting similarity. Can you comment on all of that?
Yeah, sure. And of course, under the power elite, they do all this planning way in advance because they want to create situations from which the public will respond. And so what you have with Colonel House, and he's a key player, key agent of the power elite. He takes a bunch of what's called his inquiry group to the Majestic Hotel in Paris to negotiate the outcome after the First World War. And as real young people, as Walter Lippmann, famous writer, he was a Fabian socialist. You had the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who ran our foreign policy for years under Eisenhower. I remember Eisenhower, most of the time he's either in the hospital or on a golf course, and the Dulles brothers were really running the CIA and the State Department. And they were, the ones behind assassinating. Okay, let's assassinate the Prime Minister of Iraq. Okay, let's get rid of Mossadegh. We put them in, we take them out. That sort of thing. So what they did at that stage was to create an environment from which a situation would arise that would ultimately result in another world war. So, for example, Colonel House, in about 1921 or so, said, if the First World War had not come in fierce, this is like a quote, in fierce and exaggerated form, the West would have lost whatever incentive it had to, go for a world body. In other words, the League of Nations is what they called it at the time. They were trying to get the League of Nations. But Americans, the American public is, back then the American public wasn't as stupid as it is now, dumbed down. And so they didn't go along with it. So, of course, you have to have the Second World War. And so what they did was they created such dire economic situations in Germany. They imposed, all of these requirements and payments and the Rhine land. I mean, all this land was taken, all this sort of stuff, and they basically were bankrupting Germany. So the Weimar Republic, which had taken over after the First World War, really didn't have much of a chance of survival. It basically collapsed economically, which, of course, according to Paralletes, what they wanted to happen, because then you could have this savior, Hitler, come along and take over. Now, he can't just say, hey, I'm your savior, go with me. You have to have a villain, right? So the communists were portrayed as the villain. So the National Socialists said, those communists, they're doing it in Germany. And so when they had the Reichstag fire, they blamed it on the communists. Hitler said, yes, those communists, they did it, like that. And they carry that sort of policy through, like I said, in Iran. What we did in Iran wasn't just say, okay, we're going to fund this revolution. You always have to put the other guy as the villain. So what we did was the people dress up in Iran, the Nazis and the CIA trained guys and all of them. They would dress up as members of the Tudeh Party. Now, the Tudeh Party in Iran in 1953 was the pro-communist party. But it was really us, right? We were really, these guys who were our guys, they went around burning mosques, right? And so the Iranian public says, oh, look at those evil Tudeh Party guys, who were really our guys, burning mosques. So it's those evil communists. The communists were portrayed in Iran as the villain, when it was really us and our guys dressed up like the communists doing this stuff. Same thing with in Iraq. For example, you remember that the British had control of the southeastern part of Iraq. We were in Baghdad and Mosul and all that, but down around Basra, the British were largely in charge of that. And you might recall that there was an incident down there where a couple of guys dressed as Arabs were running around shooting up the place, right? Shooting up, consternation. Well, the police down there, the Iraqi police in the Basra, caught the guys and stuck them in jail. Well, as it turns out, those guys weren't really, Arab terrorists of, a Sunni or Shia, Sunni against the Shia who were in southeast Iraq. They were really British intelligence agents, right? So the British send in tanks and bang down the walls of the Iraq jail and grab their guys out and take off. Now, you might say, well, what are they doing? They're supposed to be keeping the peace, the British are down there. So, just think about that. Instead of keeping the peace, they're shooting up the place, creating a crisis and consternation. So they do this sort of thing. And so what you do is you stir up, the Reichstag fire. It's the communists who are doing it. Or in Iran, it's those communists when it's really our guys doing that sort of thing. And so what you have with Hitler is he has to have an excuse, right? And he comes in. Now you say Hitler, 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 Hitler. Well, Hitler was a nothing. You say, what do you mean Hitler? He's a penultimate evil. No, he's a nothing. Hitler's a nothing. You say, what do you mean he's nothing? Well, he was only a corporal in the First World War, so he's no military strategic genius. And what kind of profession did he have? Well, he was a house painter and a postcard painter. A paper hanger. He went around Berlin painting postcards, say, hey, you want to buy a postcard? And that's all he could do. However, he had been taken under wing by Rudolf Hess, who was the party chief in the Thule Society. The Thule means like Aryan race, sort of an occultic group. And he was trained and very, very adept at mesmerizing or hypnotizing large crowds, like Deutschland über alles. And so what was he doing? Well, he was reacting against this austerity that the Allies, including the British, U.S., had created in World War I. He said, we are not depressed people. We are not down. We are not defeated. We are a wonderful Aryan race. We should be proud. And so all the German people say, yay! They scream, yay, hooray, hooray. And so he instills their pride again, right? So they'll go along with anything. I mean, once you're beaten down, somebody comes along and says, you can have pride again. You say, yeah, whatever you want. And so they all blinded themselves to the loss of freedoms that they were undergoing, the undermining of the Christian faith in Germany, which had been sort of strong, and now it was just sort of undermined. There's a good book called Hitler's Cross. Regarding that, how they undermined the Christian church in Germany, and created at least willingness to tolerate all these nasty things that Hitler was doing right and left. And of course, he had allied with the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran. Like the old Shah of Iran in the 1930s, very much admired Hitler. Because he changed the name of the country at the time. It was called Persia, and at that time in the 30s, the old Shah changed the name of Persia to Iran because in Farsi, their language, the word Iran means Aryan, like the Aryan race, like Hitler and the Aryan race. See? And so they were creating these alliances all through there for this larger purpose of the power elite to manipulate this whole sort of situation and create a climate out of which would come this sort of order ab chaos is the phrase, order out of chaos. They want to create order out of chaos. And you can see this in a lot of old westerns. If you like old westerns, there's a Roy Rogers old-time B-western called Young Bill Hickok. And you say, oh, Roy Rogers, no, they're there. This guy comes secretly off the coast. He said, at night, it begins late at night, and he comes, and he says, he's from another country, and what they're doing is, during the time of the Civil War, they're going to carve out the western part of the country, including California. Foreign powers are going to get it, and the guy comes in and says, we will bring order out of your democratic chaos. So you can see all this stuff, and it ends with sort of John Wilkes Booth has written a letter to this guy. It's a pretty good old Western. So anyway, if you know where to look for stuff, and I know where to look for these papers, Colonel House, for example, has a letter written to him by Franklin Roosevelt. At the end of Franklin Roosevelt's first year in office, I think it's November 21, 1933. And so FDR is writing to Colonel House, who is Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor. And he says to him, Roosevelt in the letter says to House, he says, I've just talked to Jack Morgan, the J.P. Morgan Jr., and he says, quote, the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in our larger centers has owned our government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson, end quote. Now, it doesn't just say influence. Money talks, right? But they own it. That means they can break it, they can do whatever, they own the government. And Woodrow Wilson had said something similar. He said in his in 1912 at a speech in, I think it's October 19th, in Carnegie Hall, when he was running for the presidency, he says, some of the biggest men in manufacturing and commerce have confided to me privately, they're afraid of something, they're afraid of somebody, because they know there's a power so complete, so pervasive, so interlocked, so watchful, you better not speak above your breath when you speak in condemnation of it. So Wilson knew, what the score was with these guys, too. And so there are these powerful people, largely behind the scenes. Sometimes they come to the fore. David Rockefeller, for example, is out in the open. And if you go to your local library and look at a book called Memoirs written by Rockefeller, it's a big old thick book, 2002. He says on page 405, he says, some people believe me and my family are part of a secret cabal, internationalists, who are conspiring against the best interests of the United States in order to form a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. Then he puts a period, and his next sentence is, if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it, end quote. So if you know where to look, you can find these guys, what they're planning, what they admit to, and so forth.
Hey, Preppers and Patriots, that's the end of part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Dennis Cuddy on the New World Order and the globalist agenda. Tune in next week to get the rest of the show. Thanks so much for listening.
In the Days of Noah, Book 2, Persecution by best-selling author Mark Goodwin. A globalist conspiracy transpires by way of a false flag attack against America's energy infrastructure. Noah and Cassandra Parker witness a complete economic meltdown, which is intentionally triggered by the event. The assault is blamed on patriots and Christians who are rounded up into detention centers across the country. Noah and his friends must take action to prepare for the meltdown and defend against the totalitarian regime, which is gunning for their freedom and, quite possibly, their very lives. Get your copy of The Days of Noah, Book 2, Persecution for Kindle, paperback or audio edition at Amazon.com today.